So for our third panel on transportation, which we learned this week from the Energy Information Administration is now the largest source of emissions in the US, so we've got a lot to talk about here. Guiding us in this discussion is Vicki Arroyo. Vicki is the Executive Director of the Georgetown Climate Center. We've heard this a bit today, but I will say it's hard to think of another organization in higher ed that has done more than the Georgetown Climate Center to help inform smart climate policy at the state level. So, Vicki, we're honored to have you, and I would encourage the rest of the panelists to come on up, and we'll get going. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. So thank you so much, Tom, and thank you, MIT, for your wonderful partnership in this panel and this effort. And today has been amazing, and it's really been great to be here and hear all the great stories of leadership here in New England and in our Canadian provinces. I think coming out of Washington, D.C., it really helps to get out of the nation's capital, as you can imagine, these days. You know, this is what it's all about. So it's really great to be here and to see the kind of leadership that's happening. Transportation is a particularly, I think, daunting sector to be discussing here, and we'll talk about that with some true experts in a minute. But it's also, I think, a really exciting time to be talking about transportation as it relates to climate policy. It is the largest sector of greenhouse gas emissions in the region. And as we all know, and as I mentioned about living in DC right now, federal efforts to weaken standards across the board in so many sectors, including transportation, are likely underway, making it even more difficult to achieve not only our national greenhouse gas reduction goals, but also harder for leading states like Massachusetts and others that have greenhouse gas emission targets to meet their reductions. In public comments filed earlier this year, we heard from Massachusetts, New York, and other states, making it clear that emission standards for light-duty vehicles are critical for them to be able to continue making progress in reducing emissions, not only for 2020 targets, but beyond in 2030 and even 2050. And so the lack of federal leadership and even potential rollbacks makes it even more important for states to take the lead on policy action. So the good news is that states across this region have been taking steps, often with other states and provincial partners, to put policies in place that promote a low-carbon transportation future. This work is often conducted, as you've heard today already, through multi-state collaborations, such as the Zero Emissions Vehicle Memorandum of Understanding, or ZEV MOU, as we call it, accelerating electric vehicle deployment. So that's with governors and states, 8 states, that have committed to deploying 3.3 million electric vehicles on the road by 2025. At the same time, we see technology costs declining and innovative companies stepping up and bringing in new lower carbon products to market. Some countries and companies are also announcing a transition away from the internal combustion engine. The chairman of Shell Oil said that his next vehicle is going to be an electric vehicle. And Shell is actually becoming more of an energy station when you pull up to what used to be just gasoline stations in other parts of the world, because they're actually installing electric vehicle charging infrastructure in their stations. And state and regional climate efforts for transportation have been ongoing in this region for several years. I mentioned the ZEV MOU that many states participate in. Also, they have worked together through our Clean Fuels and Vehicles work group, ably led by Christine, who was here earlier, from Christine Kirby. Is she still here? Yay! From Massachusetts, and other state leaders who, among many other successes, I would say, over the years, recently got a corridor designation from USDOT for this region, where all 12 states in our Transportation and Climate Initiative have nominated corridors for designation, and a multi-state application that was led by our friends from VTrans in Vermont. And earlier this year, the New England governors and Eastern Canadian premiers passed a resolution concerning transportation that was referenced earlier. And then finally, last but not least, just last month during COP23, as you heard from Jared and from Katie earlier, 8 Northeast and Mid-Atlantic jurisdictions in our Transportation and Climate Initiative, including Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, Massachusetts, New York, Rhode Island, Vermont, and DC, announced that they are initiating a process to seek public input and engage with their local communities and businesses on potential policies to both improve the transportation system throughout the region and to reduce emissions from this important sector. And this comes on the heels of an earlier announcement and extensive analysis that was done by our team and Cambridge Systematics that showed that reductions in emissions from the sector are very possible and actually could yield net economic benefits to the region. And announcement that 6 jurisdictions in TCI made in 2015 around the Paris climate talks to pursue potential market-based policies together. The more recent step was taken with support from many businesses, utilities, including the New England Power Generators Association and NGOs. And it also followed some very large summits that we held in DC and New York that some of you attended, so thank you for that. As we heard earlier, and I'm sure we'll hear more from Secretary Pollack momentarily, Massachusetts has recently completed a series of listening sessions soliciting input on what this low-carbon transportation future might look like. Dan Gatti of Union of Concerned Scientists has been working with others on sharing and developing a specific policy approach that he will be talking about today that builds on the RGGI success in a cap and invest program. We'll be hearing from MIT professor Jessika Trancik on her work and the relationship between policy and technological innovation in this important sector. And of course, companies play an important role. It's a very exciting time as technology cost decline and innovative companies are bringing new lower carbon products into the market. Companies like Tesla, BYD Industries, and Proterra are bringing medium and heavy duty electric trucks and buses to the market, looking to replace conventional diesel with zero emission vehicles that will improve air quality. Hydrogen fuel vehicles are increasingly used in many applications, including forklift and heavy lifting and distribution centers for Amazon and Walmart. And we're lucky to have with us Mike Tamor of Ford, who will discuss their own technological innovations and his views of what policies can support such innovation and some of the current challenges. So our focus is going to be on state and regional efforts and partnerships that may be able to create this vision for the future that we're all trying to bring about of a low-carbon transportation future in the region. And I want to start off with someone who I think with this audience especially needs no introduction, because Secretary Stephanie Pollack of Mass DOT is now, of course, the Secretary and CEO of the Massachusetts Department of Transportation, but has a long history of working on these issues, both in academia and NGO space, and as a true expert. And I'd like to start by having you please describe what you consider to be the main opportunities in transportation, in a low-carbon transportation future in Massachusetts, and how you're setting out to achieve them.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. What I would start with, I want to talk a little bit about context, and then I'll talk a little bit about what the opportunities are and how we're trying to capture them. So, not to be too provocative, but there's a reasonable case to be made that there is no such thing as a transportation sector. It's very different than the building sector or the electricity sector. It's actually just you and me and our friends and neighbors trying to get where we're going. So there's hundreds of millions of us. And so that's the first point, is it's just there are some high leverage points in the system, but there aren't nearly as many high leverage points as you might think. The second thing I would say is, when I started doing energy work in the really early days, we won't say how early, and so I'm still an Amory Lovins person. And one of the things that Amory Lovins did that forever transformed how we think about the electricity side was to point out that no one wanted kilowatts or therms, they wanted heat, light, and power. What he meant by that was the social utility of the electricity system, of the power system, was heat, light, and power. That's the thing we wanted. And if there was a way to provide heat, light, and power differently, in a lower carbon way, in the context of this discussion, that no one would care. The actual public wouldn't care because they didn't want carbon, right. So in transportation, here's the problem. We have not yet defined our heat, light, and power. Most of the people who work in the transportation sector actually think vehicle miles traveled is the social utility. And so when you talk about reducing those, it's problematic. But they're not. And the reason that we know this is you don't have to have taken economics at MIT like I did. No one wakes up in the morning and says, today I want to travel 47 miles. So therefore, that is not the social utility of the transportation system, right? The social utility of the transportation system, and by the way, the social utility of the transportation system isn't even mobility. So I'll talk about mobility as a service. I'm sure we'll talk about mobility as a service. But mobility assumes you want to get from point A to point B. But if that were true, then no one would be taking online courses or ordering from their computer, because it's not actually where you want to go. It's what you need to have, right? And sometimes that involves travel, and sometimes, increasingly, it doesn't even involve travel anymore. So we actually need to come up with a low-carbon strategy for an unbelievably diversified and decentralized group of sources that are really ultimately at their bottom about three things. The first thing is it's about people. And that's very messy and much harder than other areas of carbon reduction, because we all have our own travel behaviors and preferences, and they vary widely, and they're not necessarily completely rational. The second thing it's about is actually land use. Where really matters when it comes to transportation carbon emissions. I can make a map of travel in Massachusetts, because we read everybody's odometer once a year, so I can make a map, and I can tell you that the number of miles driven by people in cars in Massachusetts varies by a factor of at least 10 based on where they live. And so if we had more, if you literally could take everyone in Massachusetts and simply get them to the lowest amount of vehicle travel of the lowest vehicle mile travel communities in Massachusetts, would solve the whole carbon problem. So we don't have to get below where people are actually doing today. We just have to get everybody to where a few people are. And then the third thing that matters, of course, is technology, vehicle, and fuels, which there's a lot of people who are going to probably talk about a lot more than I will, but I will say that I do not actually believe that there is a technology silver bullet for reducing transportation sector greenhouse gas emissions, not even fleets of autonomous electrified vehicles, because autonomous electrified vehicles take up exactly the same amount of space on the road and at the curb and in your driveway as they do. They may move around more, but at the end of the day, it is going to really be hard to get as many people in individual vehicles into Kendall Square between 7 and 7:30 in the morning as many people as the Red Line does. I would actually argue it's probably impossible to get as many people in vehicles into Kendall Square at 7 o'clock in the morning as the Red Line does. So where does that lead me to believe? It leads me to believe, one, we need a dense enough region served by a high volume transit backbone in order to be the sort of spine of our key transportation system, particularly for moving commuters at peak travel hours in the morning and afternoon. Second of all, the only truly decarbonized trip is actually the one you walk. Everything else, there's some carbon involved in building the car, building the bicycle, moving it around. So walking trips depend on distance. That means you have to be in walking distance of some place. Just to give you my least favorite statistic about current travel behavior in the United States, 1/3 of all trips of under a half mile are driven in the United States of America. Okay, so we got a lot of work to do on travel behavior change. Electrification is absolutely part of the solution, but I would note that if we're serious about transit, then we need to focus on electrifying the vehicles that carry more than one person at a time. That's everything from the TEAS buses to school buses, of which we have a lot in this state. So we're currently, what we're actually doing, since there are 3 manufacturers of electric buses in the United States and almost no data on in-service performance that would make a transit system willing to adopt that technology, we're actually buying the different vehicles for different transit agencies, and then with some help from MIT, actually doing in-service comparisons so that we can hopefully more quickly get to the answer of which companies' vehicles work best in which types of situations, rather than have everybody just sort of, right now everyone's kind of going out and buying 1 or 2 buses to kind of play with, and that's not really going to get us to an electrified transit network very quickly. And then the final thing that I would say that I'm happy to talk about more is you still have to stick to the basics and tend to your knitting, unless you believe in either flying cars or chitty chitty bang bang. All of the technology we're talking about involves traveling on roads and bridges. Ours are in terrible shape. And when they're in terrible shape, it actually makes travel worse, which increases its carbon footprint if people are, you know, congested or not willing to travel. So we still have a lot of very basic work to do on sort of roads and bridges. And sometimes we forget that because we focus on vehicles and fuels. But I don't have the luxury of doing that. So that's a place where I spend a lot of my time.
Great tour of your world. So next I'd like to turn to MIT's Associate Professor for Energy Studies, Jessika Trancik, and would love to hear more about your own work here. policy solutions into technology innovations from your perspective.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I really enjoyed those the comments that have been made by both our moderator and our first panelist. So thank you so much. Well, so I wanted to make two main points. One is based on some of my research that I've been doing over the years, why I think there's great potential for subnational actors to really make a difference in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions both within and outside of their borders, and also why I think that's important now more than and sort of why there's more potential now, perhaps than before, even than 5 or 10 years ago. And then I want to share a couple of comments on how I think research, together with practice and researchers working closely with practitioners, might be able to accelerate the technological transition and also the innovations that we need to drive greenhouse gas emissions down in transportation in particular, but some of these ideas apply to other sectors as well. So the reason I'm saying that we have this opportunity now as subnational actors, and this ranges from individuals to cities to companies to regions, more so than even 5-10 years ago, is because the ratio of the economic opportunity to the economic cost of driving greenhouse gas emissions has decreased. We see this in transportation as well as in other areas. And we don't see this across the board in transportation, but in some subsectors of transportation we see this. So for example, in the case of batteries and electric vehicles, and we know that electric vehicles in most locations around the country can substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, even with today's electricity supply mix. And in these technologies, we have seen very significant cost reductions such that a consumer today does not have to pay more for an electric vehicle than an internal combustion engine vehicle. So that's kind of the denominator of the economic opportunity to the economic cost ratio that I talked about. But what about the economic opportunity? And here I'm drawing on some research that we've done going from the level of devices, looking at where these trends have come from. Why have these technologies improved over time? What has occurred at the level of devices and manufacturing, in business strategies, as well as in policies that have caused these technology cost trends in batteries, as well as in solar energy as one of the primary examples. And here, what we find from kind of tracking these innovations from the device to policies is that, and we can quantify this, that there's been a very strong feedback between policies to cut emissions and technological improvement. And that feedback loop can form a virtuous cycle of emission reduction policies and technological improvement. And this is one of the reasons why I said that while it's important, one of the earlier speakers mentioned to think about everybody doing their part, and that's a motivation for subnational actors, however small, to get involved. I think it doesn't stop there. So it's not just that. What we see based on looking at what's happened in the past is that efforts on the part of individuals ranging to regions can really drive technological improvement, drive costs down, and this can open up markets not just within a region's border, but far beyond. So the fact that we're at this point right now with some of these low carbon energy costs and looking at where that's come from, where that change has happened, makes me somewhat optimistic that as subnational actors, we can really make a difference. But of course, there's a lot of work to do. And we have to look no further than the emissions trends as compared to emissions targets, to see that. So there's a lot more work to do to kind of change the sign of the emissions trends in many places and really increase the rate of change in the opposite direction, in the negative direction. And so there's obviously a lot of work for many different actors and many ways in which people can contribute. But I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts on how researchers, together with practitioners, may be able to help make our efforts, we're always constrained in terms of the time and the financial resources we have to tackle these problems, but to help make these efforts perhaps more effective or as effective as they can be. And here the point I want to make is that I think practitioners and researchers have a lot of opportunities to work together to move from adjectives to numbers. And so, for example, if I say that an electric vehicle can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, by how much? And what is the spread across different models? Can we quantify that? Well, we can. And how do current batteries in electric cars compare to people's driving needs? It's not just a technological problem, but the constrained range of electric vehicles is something that's really important. So these are the sorts of questions that we can quantify. So in my own research, for example, and actually wasn't allowed to show any numbers or slides, so that might be one barrier we want to cross here. But if you want to check out carboncounter.com, you can look up how different cars compare to one another in terms of their costs and carbon emissions, as well as how they compare to climate policy targets. And you can see that there is a wide spread. You can also see that general trend that I mentioned, that one doesn't have to pay more today for a low-emitting vehicle. This question of range is one that we've looked at in my research group as well. So, for example, we asked for one of those lowest cost vehicles on the market today. We took the Nissan Leaf, but the Ford Focus Electric is very similar, and there's some other models there. If you took a bird's eye view of the country, and you asked how many cars on the road daily could be replaced by these cars and still meet the daily energy needs of those vehicles, we estimate that that number is about 90%. Now, that doesn't mean that 90% of people can go out or will go out and buy electric cars today, but quantifying the potential, and in this case, the technical potential, can allow us to ask and inform how incentives are structured. We can look at how incentives might be structured at different price points for different cars. This model also gives us a very detailed picture of how people are driving on a second-by-second basis around the country within cities, and that can also be used to inform charging infrastructure policy and where we might be able to put charging stations in order to derive the greatest benefit. And these are benefits that we're also working on quantifying. So while there are uncertainties, one can still, is what I found in these projects, one can still draw conclusions and derive quantitative insights from studying these problems. But I want to just end with the point that collaboration is really important. So it's not enough for a researcher to publish a paper and put it out there. People don't have time. Many people don't have time to read research papers, right? And it's also not enough for researchers on their own to be coming up with the questions. It's really important for researchers to work together with practitioners in the private sector and the public sector as well. So that's one of the reasons I'm excited about this conversation that we're starting here today. And of course, everyone's really busy, but if one can keep a conversation going within requiring a reasonable time commitment from the participants, I think we can go a long way.
That's great. That's great. And that's a great lead-in to Mike, who is now the Henry Ford Fellow on Energy Systems and Sustainability with Ford, and would love to hear Ford's views of some of the big opportunities that you see in the transportation sector, moving to a cleaner energy future, and what some of the challenges may be to realizing that vision.
Okay. I kind of have to apologize for three things. First of all, I'm getting over a cold, so my voice is a little hoarse. Second, I don't know if I should be apologizing, but it appears I'm the only person from industry in this whole conference. And so just in terms of takeaway lessons, the people who actually have to build and sell this stuff should be really part of the conversation. And then thirdly, because I don't want to really speak to Ford's position or Ford's technology, simply because I feel like I'm more of a representative of the industry as a whole, or the vehicle industry as a whole, as much as anything else. But the work I've been doing over the last decade or so has been really kind of on looking for pragmatic approaches to solving this as a global problem without presuming a large amount of behavioral change or revision of the urban infrastructure simply because of the time scale that we're on. If you look at, like, everybody in this room knows what RCPs are. Of course,
The
all
climate
hands
projections.
flying.
The climate projections?
Yeah, representative and concentration pathways. So you look at what the Paris Accord requires in order to try to get under the 2 degree C trajectory. And it amounts to reducing our global CO2 emissions by 5% per year. There's been very few products that improve at the rate of 5% per year. And this is not just you can't say, well, this is a Moore's Law kind of thing. Because this is something physical. It's energy, it's motion. And to try to take 5% of the energy, basically, out of something every year for the next 20 or 30 years is really fairly spectacular. And the goal is to get from where we are today to essentially zero emissions by 2080. Any decision we take today in terms of products won't even begin to have an effect. If we get motivated to do a new product today, some completely new technology, it might be 6 years or 4 years maybe before it gets on the road. So we're making decisions now that we're going to have to live with for the next 40 years. So people who build power plants and build factories and build infrastructure really need to be looking at the end game, not at the kind of intermediate onesie, twosie sorts of things. And that's a lot of the questions that have come up here. So just to look at that long-term thing, we've heard it mentioned today several times that 60% or so of our national greenhouse emissions come from light and medium-duty transportation. And I'm talking about in transportation, though. 60% or so comes from light and medium-duty, and 40% of transportation emissions come from heavy-duty aviation, shipping, off-road. And off-road doesn't mean ATVs and things. Off-road is farm tractors and construction machinery and things like that. But if the One National program stays in force, and the auto companies, just for the record, are not against maintaining the One National program, they just wanted the review completed in order to make sure everybody understands the technology flexibilities that will be used in achieving the One National program. This could still end in a cat fight, I have to admit, but nobody's asking, the automakers are not asking for a rollback of the standards. They're asking that everybody stick to the plan that was in place from 2012. If the One National program is successful and completed, but economic trends continue more or less as business as usual, you can just look at the EIA trends, that is actually going to flip around. And it's because aviation and freight and construction usage go up pretty much in lockstep with GDP, whereas sort of your VMT per person in this country and the number of vehicles on the road is more or less stabilizing, and we're making some very big inroads into their fuel consumption. So you have an interesting situation where you say, okay, I want to go out and electrify as much as I can. It's actually less than you thought it was going to be. So I want to just jump here, and everybody remembers what I said in 2011 that got in the news, where I gave a seminar at an SAE event where I said electric vehicles are not going to take off in large numbers until you can achieve 200 miles of all-weather range. The marginal cost of increasing range, not the average cost of the batteries, but the marginal cost of increasing the range of an EV, it falls to $60 per kilowatt hour, and you're able to do most of a charge in 10 minutes. EVs would not take off. And that's based, like Jessica was talking about, on very detailed understanding of the heterogeneity of usage. And that was viewed as extremely pessimistic. Tamor just said EVs are never going to happen. No, I said it won't happen until these happen, and that might be quite a while. Well, those things happen way faster than anybody anticipated. So electric vehicles are starting to find some traction finally. However, even if we electrified all of what could reasonably be electrified without interfering with the way the customer needs to use their vehicle, in light and medium duty, we could electrify about 70% of the vehicles. But that would only displace about 50% of the fuel, simply because the people who are least amenable to electrification are the ones who are doing the most driving. Either they need a huge amount of range, a huge amount of energy, or just get aggravated by having to stop and charge so often. And then in the heavy-duty sector, it's much, much more difficult to electrify, although electrifying long-haul trucking does look somewhat plausible. So the bottom line is, we do all these things that we talk about, we will still need a lot of chemical fuel. And it's a lot less than we use today, but it's still a lot. And the question is, where is that going to come from? Well, for the part that we've electrified, we need zero carbon electricity. If we're going to make hydrogen, we need zero carbon electricity. If we want to use biomass, I'm sorry, let me go back one second. If we want to pull CO2 out of the atmosphere, we need a lot of low carbon electricity. If we want to use biomass, you don't need the electricity necessarily, but all biological processes throw away half the carbon between the farm and the fuel. If you want to get 100% carbon efficiency so you can bring the food versus fuel equation back into alignment, you need a lot of renewable electricity. So all roads lead back to the need to decarbonize the grid, and not just decarbonize it, but to over-decarbonize it. Basically to put together a set of policies that will drive the stationary users of energy to zero so that you'll have lots of zero carbon electricity in order to synthesize and provide energy to the parts of the economy that require energy density for mobility. But the upshot of this, and I'll try to stop right there, is that today we have two separate energy economies. We have a mobility energy economy that runs largely on liquid petroleum products, and we have a stationary economy that runs on natural gas, nuclear, and coal, and with a growing amount of solar and wind. Those two economies must become one if we are going to stop using fossil fuels. And we need to think in terms of the research, we need to think in terms of the policies that support and that anticipate and support that integration.
So that's great. And that's a great transition to Dan, because Dan has written about what a Reggie for Transportation or a cap and invest program might look like, and also written about the lessons learned from California and other states. So can you share some of your perspective about what you can do if you generate proceeds from such a program and maybe invest to deal with some of the barriers that we just heard about?
Sure, thanks a lot. And I just want to start by saying, is my mic working right now?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I just want to start by saying thank you, Vicki and Georgetown, for all of the enormous work that you guys have been doing to be able to advance clean transportation in the Northeast. I think it's been a remarkable success and quite success and all. And also, I just want to say thank you to Secretary Pollack for all the work that you've been doing here in Massachusetts. I feel like I learn a ton from you every time I hear you speak, and I really value your contributions. Let me just start by talking a little bit big picture about the importance of Northeast regional leadership. Over the past decade, the Northeast United States has helped lead the country towards clean and renewable sources of electricity. Taken together, the policies of Northeast states, from Maine all the way down to Maryland, have generated billions of dollars investments in clean electricity technologies such as solar, wind, and energy efficiency. These investments have helped transform our power generation in our region. We have achieved unprecedented penetration of renewables. We are on our way to driving coal out of the region, and we have reduced overall electricity use even at a time of economic expansion. Tackling clean transportation and having the commitment and providing the resources necessary to invest in clean transportation is the next major challenge for Northeast states. Our cars and trucks, as others have said, are now the biggest polluters in the region. Transportation as a whole is responsible for nearly 40% of our regional emissions. In addition to the climate impacts, local air pollution caused by transportation are responsible for over 50,000 asthma attacks, 1,000 preventable deaths, and $27 billion in regional health costs every year. But of course, pollution is only one of many problems facing transportation in the Northeast right now, right? You can't pick up a newspaper today without hearing about some of the major challenges impacting transportation in this region. Our public transportation services are overcrowded and underfunded. Our roads are some of the most congested in the country. 4 of the 5 states with the longest commute times are located in the Northeast. And Jared, it took you 4 hours to get here from Albany today. Let me tell you, I missed Ernest Manise speak today because it took me 45 minutes to get from East Arlington to my kids' Montessori school in North Cambridge. That was 45 minutes. Those 2 towns are right next to each other. Anyway, and then, our transportation agencies are broke. Low-income communities lack strong access to public transportation, while communities that have strong access to public transportation, those communities are increasingly unaffordable. The good news is that we have the tools and the technologies to build a better and a cleaner transportation system. Our vehicles are becoming more efficient every year thanks to the fuel efficiency programs enacted under the Obama administration, which is cutting oil use and saving consumers money. Exciting technologies such as electric vehicles offer the promise of cars and trucks and buses that can operate without tailpipe emissions and can be powered by clean energy. Thanks to our relatively clean grid here in New England, electric vehicles get the emissions equivalent of a 100-mile-per-gallon vehicle. New transportation modes, such as car sharing and automated vehicles, while not a silver bullet solution by any means, but they do have the potential to challenge the dominance of personally owned and single occupancy vehicles on our roads, opening up greater possibilities for system efficiency. And a younger generation is coming of age that shows ever greater interest in transit, cycling, and urban living. Together, these present-day technologies and trends point towards a possible future for our transportation system still on the horizon. A transportation system that does more but costs less and pollutes less. We're a network of shared electric vehicles working in concert with a first-class public transportation system, gets everybody where they need to go without burning a gallon of gasoline or getting stuck for an hour in traffic. Obviously, no single policy has the ability to address all of these challenges. Creating a better, cleaner transportation system will require multiple policies and coordination between states and local government, as well as the private sector. Vehicle emission standards are going to remain a critical piece of our strategy to be able to reduce transportation emissions. But one great place to start would be for the Northeast states to come together to launch a cap and invest program modeled after the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative covering transportation fuels. RGGI is a program with a track record of success in reducing emissions while growing the economy and saving consumers money. Under RGGI, as I'm sure many people here understand, the Northeast region has established limits on emissions from power plants that decline every year. These limits are enforced by a requirement that power plants purchase allowances from within a limited pool. The funds generated by these allowance sales are then invested in clean energy and efficiency programs. Independent analysis indicates that RGGI has helped create over 300,000 jobs, reduced emissions by 5 million metric tons, and invested in projects that will save consumers up to $4 billion. While RGGI applies only to power plants, as we heard from the previous panel, other jurisdictions, including California, Ontario, and Quebec, have expanded the cap and invest model economy-wide, and the result has been billions of dollars in new investments in clean transportation. California alone, for example, is projected to spend over $2 billion this year on clean transportation projects. Those investments include expanded light rail service in every major California metro area, including expansion of BART service to Santa Clara, a new zero-emission streetcar service in Sacramento, more frequent service on the Purple Line in Los Angeles, new zero-emission trains in Sacramento, and a new double-track infrastructure in San Diego. It all adds up to greater reliability, better service to more communities. California is also investing in improved bus service in 63 communities, ranging from rural counties to small towns to big cities. And California is also going to spend $695 million this year on clean vehicle incentives. That's just a huge amount of money compared to what we're spending here in the Northeast. Under California's enhanced fleet modernization program, low-income drivers can trade in a dirty high-emission vehicle and get a rebate of up to $14,000 when they purchase an EV. California's HVIP program offers rebates of up to $110,000 for electric buses. That's why you see a lot of California transit agencies being able to do things like make commitments to 100% bus electrification by 2030. And California is also investing over $700 million from their climate program, building affordable housing near public transportation through their Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program. If the Northeast adopted a program similar to the California, Ontario, Quebec WCI model, it would raise $4.7 billion per year for new investments in clean transportation. This would represent a massive potential increase in the funding available for clean vehicle programs, in addition to providing desperately needed funding for transit and affordable housing. The result for residents of this region would be cleaner air, less time spent in traffic, less money spent on gasoline, and a more resilient regional economy. Thank you very much.
So great. That's, wow, that got applause, yeah. So actually,
Somebody came prepared.
I know there's an audience here eager to get in on this conversation, but we heard different people's visions of what the future would be, what some of the limitations might be, some provocative statements along the way. So I want to first open the floor back for the panelists just to react to each other's statements if you have any comments or ideas or thoughts on what the secretary said or what
Well, just
Mike said or others.
thing
Yes,
real
Mike?
quick is, I didn't want to go floating all over the place, but this idea of improving the way we use our roads is very important. Vehicle to infrastructure, vehicle to vehicle, integrated traffic control could really improve the traffic flow and carrying capacity of the streets. Autonomy, just to get cars off the street so nobody's looking for a parking space, can have a huge impact. And then there's other modes. I mean, you talked about shared vehicles. When it comes time to make transportation more efficient, load factor is king. And just having more people in each vehicle makes a big difference. Improved walking, we have projects on devices to enhance the ability of people to do more of the stuff they would want to bring their car for in pedestrian spaces. So people need to carry stuff, disabilities, whatever. We have a series of projects going there. Other interesting things, you mentioned three-dimensionality with kind of a wink, but there are a lot of companies working on flying cars. In effect, they're not really flying cars, they're vertical takeoff, compact vertical takeoff electric vehicles with a range of 100 to 300 miles that could make a pretty big difference for some people who can afford them. And another item that you don't hear anything about, which I think is pretty cool, is the Ultralight Monorail, which could be installed in any urban street situation and really help. So you need to do a lot more imagination. But the other side of it is, and I think somebody said it, that we have the technology, right? The fact is we do. We tend to talk about the need to do more research, right? And we need to sort of satisfy all stakeholders or something. And it's paralyzing our whole political or social discussion. Like something needs to be invented. We heard Professor Moniz say, we need breakthroughs in this, we need breakthroughs in that. We don't need breakthroughs in anything. We can get the show on the road. We just have to do it.
Professor, what's the role of researchers?
I guess a couple of interesting takeaways, and maybe I'll come back to the comment that Mike just made. But, if we think about, this question of, Mike, you started out saying, I'm looking at systems kind of as they are and behavior as it is and not thinking about changing behavior. And the secretary made the point that, we also have the opportunity to rethink the entire system. And I guess, and then we have this question about technology. Is there a silver bullet? Do we have the technologies we need? And I guess I would just encourage us all to think about, the time series. So think about the things that we can do now that don't require behavioral change, and sort of be very conscious of, okay, what are the policy opportunities and innovation opportunities now? Maybe using existing technologies, but thinking about new business models for car sharing. What do we do in the medium term? And then all the way to the long term. And I think that can help us get over some of the, anxiety that can come up when you think about, I have to change everything, and how do I do that? Kind of break it up into, interventions at different time periods, and then also the stakeholders and the people that have agency over those things. And on this question of technology, I guess I would say that I agree that we have a lot of the technology that we need right now. For example, in the personal transportation sector, personal vehicles, technologies have come quite a long way. But there's also areas where we do need technological innovation, for heavy-duty, long-haul transportation. And so it doesn't have to be either or. So I would agree with the Professor Moniz's statement, as well as some of the statements that have been made by Mike and others, that we do have a lot of technology now.
Well, and some of the innovations, though, in technology that have allowed for things like Uber and Lyft, ride sharing, that might allow for autonomous vehicles, don't necessarily help us, though, in a carbon-constrained environment.
Right.
So I love
So innovation
Stephanie's.
doesn't actually equal decarbonization, right? So, when Zipcar came along, we weren't actually sure whether car sharing was going to reduce carbon and VMT or not. And then there were a series of pretty good studies that actually said it did, but the mechanism by which it accomplished that was actually twofold. One was non-ownership, right? So people gave up cars. And the second is it made you see the marginal cost of every trip, which if you sort of know basic economics is that would be like an economist's dream, except for people came up with a business model that did that all by itself. And lo and behold, when you make people see the marginal cost of every trip, they don't take as many because they're like, I could walk, or I could hop on the T, or I could, get in a zip car. I guess I'll walk or take the T. So we didn't know, and then we did. When transportation network companies came along, a lot of people said, well, we already figured out car sharing is good, so therefore these are good. Actually, the early data is they're terrible. They increase congestion, they increase vehicle miles traveled. Why? Because you think about the person in the back seat and you say, maybe it's supporting non-ownership, but for the person in the front seat, it's actually supporting ownership. People are owning cars so that they can drive. So in fact, the whole demography is destiny. I have 3 millennial children. Guess what? They're not different in their DNA. They were not born averse to cars, okay? They couldn't afford them during the Great Recession of 2008, 9, and 10. But guess who the fastest growing group of car buyers in the United States are? Millennials, and guess what? VMT per capita in 2017 was all the way back to where it was in 2007 before the Great Depression. So sitting around and waiting for demography or trends or preferences to, create the headwinds that are going to push us in the direction we want to go, it doesn't work that way, at least not in transportation. There are good things happening, there are bad things happening. Innovation is important, but some innovation without the proper context and government regulation. And then the last thing I would say, and I've had this conversation with a lot of my friends, cap and trade has worked really well in electricity because it does two things that both push behavior in the same direction, right? It raises the cost of the power and it creates a stream for investing in things that then help us decarbonize the system. People are relatively more price sensitive to raising the cost of their power because you actually see it every month. Most of us do not get a monthly bill called transportation. We might get a bill for our car insurance, we might get a bill for our car ownership or leasing, but it doesn't include the repairs, and it doesn't include the gas, and it doesn't include your transit, and most people actually cannot answer the question, how much a month do you spend on transportation? And all the data that I have seen has said that actually the price elasticity of travel behavior change in the transportation sector is unbelievably low and asymmetrical, meaning that when prices go down, people actually respond by driving more, but when prices go up, they're slower to change their behavior and it doesn't stick, and as soon as the prices change again, they go back to what they were doing. And so that's not a reason not to do cap and invest, but it's a reason to understand that a lot of the benefit from cap and invest is going to come from the invest side, right? It's not about directly sending a price signal, so we just need to be clear that we're not replicating Reggie. Reggie both sent a price signal and created a revenue stream for investments. It's not clear to me whether price signals are going to make a big difference or what the size of the price signal would have to be to make a difference, and whether, in fact, there is any level of political acceptability for the size of the price signal that would be necessary in order to actually change travel behavior.
But like with Reggie, and I'll let you get in on this, Dan, before we open the floor. But like with Reggie, even a modest signal to begin with that generates resources that could, at the discretion of the states, be plowed into the kinds of investments that Dan outlined, the kind of investments that you're already pursuing here, like with the bus experiments with MIT, that could actually move the dial further in the longer run.
Look, we can always spend money. Don't get me wrong. If you have any, send it my way. I will find a use for it. But that said, I do think that in transportation, we just need to be thoughtful about, what we don't know. It's not what we haven't invented. I actually agree with you on that. It's actually because it's the behavior part that's really hard to know, and that's hard to study, and I think maybe even less interesting. So just as an example, I have lobbied constantly to create networks of vehicle charging stations, okay? Just in my world, okay, of let's say people who are genuinely concerned about climate change, but somewhat have a different range of views on the role of government, the question comes back in the following two forms. A, Why? Because if you actually look at the data, 90% of all vehicle charging is actually happening at people's homes. That's what the data says. So if that's true, do networks of vehicle charging stations change travel behavior? Or is it nice and it makes us feel warm and fuzzy and it's a visible sign that we're committed to carbon, but in fact, doesn't really change how people use electric vehicles? Should know the answer to that question before you ask. And then the second one, which tends to come from the small government, but I mean, again, look, I spent 25 years of my life in the environmental advocacy world. It was really lovely. Now I live in the real world, okay? So in the real world, real human beings who feel strongly that climate change is important but skeptical about the role of government ask the following questions. So, did Henry Ford ask the government to build a network of gasoline stations when he invented the Model T?
There already was one.
Well, that was John Rockefeller because he needed a way to.
Well, all the hardware stores sold gasoline.
Right, but the point is just why does the public sector need to build the fueling infrastructure if it's as good as we all say it is in the studies and it saves people as much money? Then why do we need to spend, and I'm not saying the answer is right or wrong, but I'm saying in my world, in order to get the kind of subnational action that we're talking about, we actually need better answers to some of these questions than we have today.
So, Dan, I'm going to let you try to answer that, and then I'm going to open the floor.
There was a lot there that I'm interested in responding to. For what it's worth, I work for a science advocacy organization. Anyway, I guess one thing that I'm interested in terms of what you said, Secretary Pollack, is that, or to try to rebuild a little bit of the vision that Secretary Pollack is throwing a lot of cold water on. And I think that I feel like on an idealism spectrum about like automated vehicles, like you're very skeptical. I'm only moderately skeptical. But to kind of rebuild that sense of what the vision is like private vehicle ownership is an incredibly inefficient way to run a transportation system. The disadvantages of private vehicle ownership are something that people in the environmental community have been promoting for years. 95% of the time, a privately owned vehicle is just sitting there, parking, just being an urban blight on the landscape, right? The average car in America has 1.2 passengers. Absolutely, for sure, we can't just assume that technology companies are going to be able to solve that problem. I think we should all be past the point of assuming that Silicon Valley tech problems are just going to magically solve, problems for us without creating even bigger problems in their wake, potentially. But, if we get to automated vehicles inside car-sharing networks, there are models out there that show, the price of transportation getting down as low as 31 cents a mile. At that price, maybe, we are going to see the end of personal vehicle ownership, maybe. This is not to say that, we should just be Pollyanna about it, but, actively involved in thinking through what this process looks like, how this transformation happens, because I think there is a lot of potential for our system to become more efficient, both economically more efficient and environmentally more efficient if we do it the right way.
So with that, I think I'm going to open the floor to questions. If folks have a question, the mic will come to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm John Sturman from the Sloan School here at MIT. Super rich. I just have two issues I'd like each panelist to comment on. So we heard a lot about people complaining about the traffic congestion, including their personal stories of getting here late. As a bicycle commuter, I feel your pain, but I got here in the normal amount of time, which is way faster than driving any day. But here's the issue. Anything that purports to reduce congestion is just going to increase the attractiveness of driving and induce marginal trips until you're right back at the amount of pain that it takes now to keep that last person from taking another trip. I need to know what you all think or what policies we need to adopt, whether it's congestion pricing or something else, so as to avoid the technical innovations that will help decarbonize and maybe autonomy and shared mobility, et cetera, from just getting more people to take more trips and walking less and biking less and taking the T less. That's number one. Number two is, as Mike pointed out, in order to have any decent chance of staying under 2 degrees, which isn't safe, it's just safer than where we're headed on climate change, We have to make very, very fast changes overall. So on the vehicle side, if there's going to be a transition to electrification or whatever it's going to be that's low carbon, fast enough, we're going to have a huge surplus of used ICE gasoline vehicles. That'll drive their price down until somebody's going to find it attractive to buy and run that car on gasoline for its expected lifetime, which is 15 or more years. So what is the proposal that you would all have to deal with that? Do we need another cash for clunkers? And who's going to pay for that? It seems like it's in the interest of Ford and every other OEM because we recycle those cars. It creates more demand for the cars that are left. It's in the interest of the government. It's in the interest of the climate people. But I don't hear people talking about it. So I'd love to hear what you all say about that. Thanks.
Thank you. Why people call economics the dismal science. But those are very valid points. And I will say, as a commuter in Virginia, where the tolls, as you might have read, went up to $40, and that changed behavior the next day, I can tell you, because I was carpooling the next day, and there was really nobody there except for us and one state police car who probably could have pulled us over for speeding in an area that's usually completely backed up on I-66. So anyway, attempt to answer these two questions.
Just
Mike.
Save time, let me just hit the second one first, because
Okay.
that's the one that I've actually done some work on. And the answer to that is we have to start providing that renewable hydrocarbon fuel that I mentioned earlier than you might in some sort of ultra-rational approach, because that fuel decarbonizes every car, not just new cars. So it really behooves us to start making massive amounts of renewable hydrocarbon fuel as soon as we can. And again, that is going to depend on having massive amounts of renewable electricity.
So Dan?
Let me just say, I think I'm agreeing with both of you in saying this, that, I think there's a lot of inertia right now behind the internal combustion engine, right? The vehicles that are already on the road, the factories that are already producing internal combustion engines that need to be retooled, the consumer preferences which don't change on a dime, the infrastructure, the gas stations, the millions of miles of pipeline, like all of that stuff is inertia which is keeping us trapped with an internal combustion engine oriented approach, even though I think right now, just based on performance, in many ways, electric vehicles are already a superior option. So, I think that what you're saying very much gets at the need for us to really start making these transformations very quickly. None of this is going to be able to get into mainstream like mass, instantaneously. I do think vehicle retirement programs are an important part of the picture. That is something that California is investing some of their cap and invest resources in. That's what the Enhanced Fleet Modernization Program is about. So I think increasing vehicle turnover. I will say even more generally, when it comes to the way we think about the auto industry and their interaction with all of this, there are a lot of places in which the interests of the auto industry and the interests of the environmental community are very much aligned. Thinking about how we can use some of the resources from a program like this, or a program that, unlike vehicle emission standards, doesn't put the regulatory burden on your companies, but puts the regulatory burden on oil companies, and maybe gives auto companies some of the benefits. That's, I think an approach that makes a lot of sense to me.
So I just want to talk about congestion for a minute, and I also want to sort of get back to a point that was made. I hope that I don't come across as skeptical. What I'm trying to say to people is, it's hard and we should be strategic, and we can't just keep throwing darts at the dartboard because it's actually too important to get wrong, okay? So that's what I'm actually trying to say. And transportation change is, in the 1970s, I was already talking about I'm at it half a century. I got to tell you something. Personally owned vehicles are going to be a really hard thing to overcome, okay? I was sitting with a bunch of very progressive transportation leaders, and they were all getting all excited about fleets and stuff, and I said, how are those going to come about? And they said, well, we'll just ban personal car ownership. And I was like, in which state legislature is this going to actually pass first? Because, I'll just go and be secretary there. So we need to figure it out. So congestion is an interesting example. So why are the following 4 things happening at the same time? More distracted driving, TNCs, Some growth in transit, although only on trains, not on buses, right? Because people are trying to figure out a way to use the time that they spend in congestion instead of getting out of it. That's actually what's happening. Even in your $40 toll, that was in one lane, right? And why?
No, the whole I-66 inside the Beltway, if you want to use it, you either have 2 or more people or you pay whatever the toll, and it fluctuates, and you don't know until you
Right,
get there.
but in most places, like politically, they won't do that. They toll
Right.
a few lanes, and then what happens is they're empty, and the lanes right next to them are
Right.
sort of backed up. So we need politically acceptable strategies, right? And that's the reason people dream about autonomous cars now, because all of a sudden they say, oh, that is how I can actually text. That is how I can do my email. What are your choices for texting and doing email right now while moving? Sitting in the back of a TNC, sitting on a train or a bus, distracted driving. I would argue that's one of the #1 ways people are doing that right now. No, but we laugh, but this is the world, right? So unfortunately for us, the behavior that people is exhibiting is not congestion avoidance. It's making better use of the time while they're sitting in congestion. That is the actual behavior people are exhibiting, and we just need to understand that, and then we need to, for example, market transit as the mode in which you
Options.
actually can
Right.
get that done while not endangering everyone else who's on the road at the same time.
Unless you're the transit driver, right?
Those we take their
and
smartphones away.
it gets at giving people options, because if they have no option other than to pay $40, then that is,
right.
wrong for all kinds of reasons, right? But if they do have options, they're figuring them out really quickly, I will say, in Northern Virginia. I mean, I think this is a really interesting experiment. We are the guinea pigs, but I think it's going to make people take a harder look at Metro. It's going to make people take a harder look at their schedule and whether or not there's somebody else they can commute with. Slug lines, who knows? But it's 37% of the people the second day were in a 2-person or more
So
car.
that's really important, because when we think about buildings and we think about power, we don't necessarily think about giving people options, but in transportation, that's really central. We don't have as many levers for telling people what to do. We just don't do that when it comes to transportation. But we have a lot of levers for giving people better choice, whether it's the choice of their vehicle technology, whether it's the choice of their commuting mode, or the other thing, again, that we never want to get back to, whether it's the choice of being able to live closer to better transportation options by actually paying attention to where and at what price point we build housing for people.
So do we have time for a little bit more Q&A? We do. Okay, great. So jump in, and then if you have a question, raise your hand, and the mic will come to you.
Yeah,
Yes.
so, and the question actually on congestion brought up for me an article in the Globe last week. I don't know how many people here saw it, that maybe presents the kind of naive sort of technology will solve us all of our problems view, in which the columnist was suggesting that maybe we don't even need the T because automated shared vehicles are just going to solve all of our problems for us. And I was looking at that, I was like, there's 1 million MBTA trips taken every weekday, most of them concentrated during rush hour periods of time. Like, you take those 1 million MBTA trips and you put them in Ubers, even if they're shared Ubers, like, it would be insane. And like, so there's absolutely no guarantee that the transition to shared vehicles is going to reduce congestion. It could very well have the opposite effect if we're not paying attention to it. And then I guess one other point I just wanted to slip in there is for you policymakers out there who are thinking that cap and invest seems like a really tough political challenge. Think about banning personal automobiles. Think about banning the internal combustion engine. Those are some of the alternatives, right? So yeah, cap and invest.
Okay, sorry.
Quentin Zondervan, Cambridge City Council-elect. Thank you for fantastic discussion. I just want to challenge some of the assumptions that I'm hearing being made. For example, the notion that we're going to have renewable hydrocarbon fuels. I question whether that's even a possible thing. And if it is possible, whether that's easier than electrifying even heavy vehicles. Building on the innovation that we're seeing in light vehicles, which you stated happened much faster than was previously expected. On the question of why the government should invest in renewable or electric vehicle charging infrastructure, they shouldn't. It should cost us nothing. and B, the government owns very valuable real estate, particularly in dense urban areas like Cambridge, where 90% of the people can't charge at home because they don't have a garage, they don't have a driveway, but we have lots of road space that's being used for car storage that would be better off being used for electric vehicle charging stations. So I think there's a lot of assumptions there that we should be questioning. Similar with car ownership and automated vehicles, there's a lot of trade-offs there in terms of the cost of owning a vehicle, which is like $10,000 a year on average in the US, versus automated vehicles where you would pay less than that and you would have a car available as often. That would drive down ownership pretty rapidly. So I think there's a lot of dynamics, a lot of variables going on, and so we have to be really careful in our thinking about making assumptions and then deriving conclusions from that.
So I just want to,
Please.
so I absolutely agree, and that's exactly what I mean by we have to think strategically. I believe we will get to solutions because we have to. It's too important not to. But so let me give you an example of charging stations. I don't mean we shouldn't do any, but I just don't mean that we should imagine a future in which I don't accept the premise that the absence of government investment in charging stations is the reason that people are not adopting EVs fast enough. We're putting charging stations in corridors like on the Mass Pike because, in fact, for long distance intercity and interregional transit, even with longer ranges, people are going to need to charge, and we think it makes sense to have them at service stations because, especially given faster but not yet fast enough charging times, makes more sense that people would use them in a place where they can also be at a rest area and grab a cup of coffee. So I'm happy to put them there. I think the idea of how are we going to get them into dense areas where people don't have sort of driveways and garages is an important one. That said, that doesn't mean that we should just sprinkle them everywhere, throughout the suburbs or in places where people are going to be charging at home. We need to have that information to sort of drive a strategic investment approach. Here's a good place to invest in charging infrastructure. This is not as good a place to invest in charging infrastructure. So that's what we need to sort of spend more time on, is working those through.
And Mike, did you want to comment on the fuels angle, the renewable fuels, liquid?
I didn't make it an absolute assumption that we will have renewable liquid hydrocarbon fuel, but it's pretty clear we can have liquid hydrocarbon fuel. It's going to be more expensive than liquid hydrocarbon that you get out of the ground. But there are a lot of applications that might be so desperate for energy density, like flying airplanes, where you absolutely have to have it. So we know that's going to be a huge industry, even if it's just aviation. That's going to be a huge industry. If that fuel is available and it's zero net CO2, then you have to ask what are the constraints on using it in other applications. So I'm not saying you have to have it. I'm just saying it's quite likely we'll have it. But if we do have it, it will be highly dependent on renewable electricity, just like all the other aspects of transportation.
Jessica, anything to add on this?
Yeah, I guess I'll just say that, one way that's very useful to think about these problems is to take a portfolio approach and ask, what are our targets? What are our emissions targets? What are the different options for meeting those? So in the near term, in the medium term, and the long term, once you get out to the longer term and you're talking about technologies that maybe have been proven in the lab but are very costly, or we don't even really know how much they're going to cost, those enter into your long-term portfolio. But again, I guess I just want to say, let's think about this systematically in terms of the time horizons we're working with and the quantitative emissions targets we're aiming to meet, and then formulate these as not everyone is going to be a quantitative portfolio, amenable to a quantitative portfolio model, but it's a nice framework for thinking about how to balance the risks and the uncertainties associated with the impacts these decisions will have.
I guess I just wanted to add that I agree that home charging really needs to be a point of emphasis, which means that when we're thinking about public charging stations, we should be thinking about them in places where there are a lot of garage orphans, where there are people who can't plug in overnight. I think it's certainly clear, I would say, that most charging will take place at home. Having said that, just because that's true doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing more to provide incentives and rebates to make it easier to afford home charging stations. Quebec, for example, is using some of their revenues from their cap and trade program to be able to make it easier for people to afford home chargers. I think that's a really important thing. I think EVs make a ton of sense if you have access to a level 2 home charger so that you can keep it completely charged, in one overnight period. If you don't have access, then it becomes much more difficult. And of course, the cost of the home charging station is something that you don't have to pay if you're buying an internal combustion engine. So I think it does make sense for the state to help pick up that cost.
It can also happen in the workplace too, and that was something that our group that worked on these issues with the Transportation Climate Initiative states got support from an earlier DOE grant to do a series of guidance documents that people here might find helpful, including some of the barriers that we've talked about, charging in multi-unit dwellings, homeowners associations dealing with that, having workplace charging offered as a potential benefit, whether or not if you offer charging, does that make you a regulated utility? We've wrestled with a lot of those issues, and we've got documents that people might find useful on that front on our website. We probably have time for maybe one more question. Is that right? Right over here?
Hi, thank you all for a terrific panel.
Representative Barrett again.
I just want to probe a little bit about what it might take to demassify traffic on the road. Secretary Pollack ticked off usefully a number of things that might not work. I have read different analyses that suggest that electrification plus automation plus genuine ride sharing might work. And so here's my question. Aren't mass transit solutions and ride sharing solutions really versions of the same thing? And rather than suggest that we have to have mass transit rather than genuine ride sharing, where I essentially get into a physical space with a stranger, why isn't it possible to meet in the middle and to conceptualize mass transit in small vans where I still have a little bit of private space where I can zone out, Secretary Pollack describes so well, but it's mass transit. A number of us are in the vehicle together. Why this insistence on the part of mass transit advocates that they're not really just talking about ride sharing by another name? And why this insistence on the part of ride sharers that they're not really just talking about mass transit by a different name?
Can I just throw in something real quick?
Sure. But, okay, go on.
Yeah, I mean, before you get to the official answer, just so you know, when you talk about this, it's not just an either or, there's actually an entire spectrum going from, your own car to, an Uber type thing or a personal carpool to dynamic shuttle to bus rapid transit to heavy rapid transit. And they have their spectrum of advantages and disadvantages. So I don't think anybody's looking at it as an either or, and we're exploring all of those.
Right, so it is a spectrum, but I mean, we've been thinking about this a lot. So what we call the subway system here, okay? The number of shared origin destinations, right? So that's how travel works. A bunch of people who are starting at the same place and ending at the same place. When you have a lot of those in a short period of time, it is much easier to serve them. One red line car at rush hour, especially the way they're currently packed in, carries a lot more people than, quite frankly, 100 car sharing vehicles. I mean, it's a lot. So there are kinds of trips for which really heavy transit is what you need, because the volume of trips in the same corridor in a short period of time does it. And that's why, I mean, this is what we've been saying at the T. I'm confident that investment in high volume core transit still makes sense no matter what happens in the rest of the world, because we don't actually, because of the physical, it's like physics. It's the two objects can't occupy the same space at the same time, law of physics. It's still going to make sense. Buses, I continue to believe are a good investment, but largely because they're so flexible. And if I'm wrong, and it doesn't make sense to run them 20 years from now because we should actually have 6-passenger vans that are dispatched, we would have tied up a lot, we would have stranded a lot of investment in the bus system, right? So in the, if you think the short, medium term, I'm positive heavy transit makes sense in short, medium, and long term. I'm positive we need better buses in the short term because that's what I have right now. And I'm confident enough that I won't strand them in the long term because they only have a 12-year useful life. So if I think that's a good investment for 12 years, I can make it. And the one that we're actually going to be talking about at Monday's T-Board meeting, which is the hardest one, is it's really hard to figure out commuter rail. It's actually hard to think about a future 20 or 30 years down the road with autonomous vehicles. Are there still suburbs? Are they residential, or are they more mixed use? And will people really prefer a sort of an hour-long trip in a train to an hour-long trip in an autonomous shared vehicle? That one for me is a lot tougher. And so that means in a risk portfolio that sort of long-term investments in the commuter rail system need to be thought out. Doesn't mean we're not going to make them. Don't get me wrong. Doesn't mean we are going to make them, but we actually have to think about what are the competitive modes. So one of the things we're looking at for commuter rail right now, for example, is leasing locomotives instead of buying locomotives, because they're 50-year assets. Well, at the T, they're 70 or 80-year assets, but they're supposed to be 50-year assets. And I do think the world will be so different in 50 years that owning a giant diesel locomotive may have been not a great thing to acquire in the year 2017, but maybe I'll lease one for 10 years so that I can sort of see what happens to autonomous cars or what happens. So that is literally the kind of analysis that we are trying to do right now on the transit side. What are the smart investments, whether it's short, medium, or long? What are the ones that we're sure are good in the short term, but we're not as sure? How do we hedge if we're not sure? And how do we, I mean, I'm not against transportation network companies. I'm concerned that the current pattern of use is appearing to be counterproductive in some very dense urban places, but that doesn't mean you give up. It means you say, how do you leverage them? So at the T, one of our most popular services right now is a deal with transportation network companies for our paratransit customers, because compared to a ride wheelchair-equipped van that you have to call 24 hours in advance, TNC vehicle is totally liberating for a disabled driver. And especially our non-wheelchair dependent, which is, by the way, 80% of all paratransit users in Massachusetts do not need a specialty vehicle. They have a different kind of handicap, visual or otherwise. You go talk to the kids at the Perkins School for the Blind about what it means to run the paratransit system through an Uber or Lyft app. They're delighted. So this is not pro-TNC, anti-TNC. This is how do you use them when you think that your job is to create a transportation ecosystem that is equitable as well as sustainable, and it actually meets people's transportation needs.
So I would like the secretary to have last word. Sorry.
I just did. So
because I actually think it's sort of a nice way to close, because we started out by saying that this is both the most daunting and exciting sector in which to work. I mean, I think you can see why it's really sort of cool. I mean, for those of us who came up through more of an environmental or an energy background, to get to know all this jargon and all the, just changes that are on the horizon and how dynamic it is. I mean, it's really very fascinating, and I really very much appreciate all of you spending your time and sharing your expertise with us today. Please join me in thanking the panel.